The wind didn't just whistle through that mountain pass. It screamed. A raw, high country scream that scraped the granite cliffs and tore at the canvas of a broken-down wagon. The wagon tilted at a sick angle, its back wheel spinning uselessly over the edge of a ravine that dropped 1,000 feet into shadow. It was a death trap, plain and simple, and inside someone was crying. Silas Boone heard it over the shriek of the wind. He pulled his mule to a stop, his weathered hand gripping the lead rope. His other hand drifted to the hilt of the big knife on his belt. You didn't survive in these mountains by being careless. He was a trader, a man who knew the high trails better than the lines on his own palm. He'd seen bears, rock slides, and flash floods. But this felt different. This felt like a different kind of danger. "Hello?" he called out, his voice a low rumble that the canyon walls swallowed and spat back at him. The only answer was a shiver of canvas and another soft whimper. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He crept toward the wagon, every sense on high alert. The horses were gone. The harness was cut. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Someone had been left here to die. He ripped back the canvas flap, and his breath caught in his throat. Curled on the floorboards, surrounded by overturned crates, was a young woman. She was black, and she was big. Not just tall, but wide and solid. A person who took up space in the world. But right now she looked small. She was shivering so hard her teeth rattled, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold in what little warmth she had left. Her dress was thin cotton, a summer dress, completely useless against the mountain's icy breath. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile, cracking thing. "Don't leave me." Silas was not a man of many words. He was a man of the mountains, hard, quiet, and direct. He saw the world in simple terms, right and wrong, life and death. And leaving this woman to freeze was a wrong so profound it made his blood boil. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gruff to hide the anger he felt. "The wagon, it started to slide," she stammered. "Mr. Jenkins, he took the horses, said he'd send help." Her voice broke. "That was yesterday morning. Yesterday morning. An entire day and a night had passed. A night that would have killed a smaller person. A night that had nearly killed her. Jenkins wasn't coming back. He'd left her as surely as if he'd put a pistol to her head." Anger, cold and sharp, coiled in Silas's gut. "What's your name?" he asked. "Delilah. Delilah Carter, sir." "Well, Miss Carter," Silas said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Let's get you out of this death trap." He reached in, his powerful arms easily finding purchase. "Hold on to my shoulders." She hesitated for only a second. Then her arms went around his neck. He grunted with the effort of the lift. She was heavy, solid, but it was a good weight, the weight of someone who had survived. As he pulled her free from the tilting wagon, her body was warm against his, a surprising living warmth despite the cold that radiated from her skin. He set her down on the trail and her legs nearly buckled. He kept a steadying hand on her arm. It was then, in that moment, with this shivering, abandoned woman clinging to him for support, that he felt it. A feeling he hadn't felt in years, not since his mother read the scripture by the firelight. It was a sense of purpose, clear and undeniable, like a lightning strike on a clear day. He heard the sound of hooves on the trail before he saw them. A small party of travelers rounded the bend. 2 men on horseback, a family in a wagon. They pulled up short, their faces a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Their eyes went from Silas, the grizzled mountain man, to Delilah, the large black woman in a tattered dress. And then the whispers started. "That's Jenkins's girl," a woman in the wagon called out, her voice sharp with disapproval. "He came through the trading post yesterday, said his wagon broke, never said he left anyone behind." Another man on horseback laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Jenkins said she was too heavy for the horses on the steep parts, said she was eating him out of house and home." The whispers turned to sneers. The travelers looked at Delilah not as a person, but as a problem, a burden, something to be discarded. Delilah shrank under their gaze, her shoulders hunching, trying to make herself smaller. Silas felt her trembling beside him, and it wasn't from the cold anymore. It was from shame. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it in the eyes of a trapped wolf. The look of a creature knowing it was surrounded, with no way out. And that's when the spirit moved in him. It rose up, hot and fierce, a righteous anger that burned away all doubt. He was a simple man, a man who believed in signs. And this woman, delivered to him on a lonely mountain trail, was a sign. He turned to face the gawking crowd. He pulled Delilah closer to his side, his arm a protective barrier. He looked at each and every one of them, his gaze as hard and unyielding as the granite cliffs around them. His voice boomed, echoing through the pass, silencing the whispers and the sneers. By winter, he declared, the words of prophecy, a promise, a challenge to the entire world. You'll birth me twins. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped. The birds went quiet. Every eye was locked on him, on the big mountain man and the shivering black woman he held at his side. Delilah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a shock so profound it seemed to stop her breathing. Hope, fragile and terrified, flickered in their depths. The travelers stared, their mouths hanging open. They had come expecting to witness a shaming. Instead, they were witnessing something else entirely. Something wild and strange and powerful. One of the mounted men, the one who had laughed, finally found his voice. Now see here, Boone. You've been up in these mountains too long. Your mind's gone soft. Silas didn't even glance at him. His eyes were on Delilah. He saw past the extra weight, past the torn dress, past the fear. He saw the strength that had kept her alive for a day and a night in the freezing cold. He saw the spirit that refused to be broken, even under the weight of scorn. The Lord puts signs in a man's path, Silas said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. This woman is my sign. He turned to Delilah, his gaze softening. If you're willing, Miss Carter. She looked at him then, really looked. She saw the lines etched on his face by sun and wind. She saw the raw power in his shoulders. But in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in a very long time. She saw respect. He wasn't looking at her like a burden. He was looking at her like an equal. The shadows were getting longer. The cold was beginning to bite. I don't have much, Silas said, his voice for her alone. Just a cabin, a hard life. But it's an honest life. And there's room for a family if you've a mind to help me build one. Her voice was a whisper on the wind. Why? Why me? Because the man who left you here is no man at all, Silas said simply. And because I see a woman who can stand through a storm. A woman strong enough to carry the future. He raised his voice again, addressing the stunned onlookers. I'll need witnesses. This is a vow made before God and all of you. Who among you will stand for what's right? The family in the wagon exchanged nervous glances. Finally, the father, a farmer with calloused hands, cleared his throat. We're headed to the trading post. We can speak to the justice there. Make it legal. Silas nodded his thanks. He turned back to Delilah. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. What do you say, Miss Carter? He asked. Will you trust me? She looked at the sneering faces of the crowd. She looked at the cold, unforgiving mountains. She looked at the broken wagon, a coffin that had almost claimed her. Then she looked at this strange, wild man who had appeared like a miracle, a man who offered not pity, but a partnership. She straightened her shoulders, drawing herself up to her full height. In that moment, the shivering, abandoned girl was gone. In her place stood a woman. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a certainty that startled everyone, including herself. My name is Delilah, and I reckon I will. The last ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching the tears on her cheeks and making them glitter like diamonds. Silas felt a rightness settle deep in his bones. This was his path. This was his purpose. He helped her onto his mule, settling her in the saddle as if she were a queen. He salvaged what little he could from the wrecked wagon, a small bundle of clothes, a worn hymnal. The other travelers watched in a stunned, thoughtful silence. The sneers were gone, replaced by a sense of awe. They knew they had just witnessed something profound. the founding of a family in the heart of the wilderness. As they started down the trail toward the way station, with the witnesses following behind, Delilah sat tall and straight. Silas walked beside her, his hand resting on the mule's flank. The prophecy he had spoken hung in the air, a promise of a future that was both terrifying and beautiful. By winter she would birth him twins, but first they had to survive the night. And the town that waited for them in the valley below was a different kind of wilderness, one where whispers could be as deadly as a mountain lion's claws. They were two outcasts, bound by a shocking promise. And their journey had only just begun. The way station appeared out of the dusk like a mouthful of crooked teeth. Lamplight, yellow and greasy, spilled from its windows, along with the low growl of men's voices. It was a place for hard men with hard opinions, and Silas knew they were walking into a hornet's nest. He dismounted and reached up for Delilah. His hands spanned her waist, strong and steady, as he helped her slide down. Her legs were shaky, and for a moment she leaned against him. He could feel the eyes on them from the porch, from the windows. Every man in that station was watching. The door creaked open, and the keeper, a man with a face like sour milk, filled the doorway. His gaze flicked from Silas's buckskins to Delilah's dark skin, and a sneer curled his lip. "Got rooms for decent folk," he drawled, his meaning as sharp as a skinning knife, "and a spot in the stable for others." Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Delilah and the innkeeper. His voice was quiet, but it had the deadly calm of a coiled rattlesnake. "We'll take 2 beds, and a hot meal, for both of us." He let the threat hang in the air. He wasn't a man who started fights, but he was damn sure a man who finished them. He pulled his purse from his belt, heavy with the profits from a season of trapping, and slapped a stack of coins on the counter. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the common room. "My coin spends the same as any man's," Silas said, his eyes locking with the keeper's. The keeper's greed won out over his prejudice. He grudgingly took the money and gestured toward the kitchen. The common room was a sea of hostile faces. Traders, drovers, prospectors. Every one of them was staring. Whispers slithered through the room like smoke. "Look what the mountain coughed up. Heard he found her up on the pass. Jenkins just left her there. Can't blame him. Look at the size of her." Delilah's cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear, to fold into herself and become invisible. But then she felt Silas's hand on her elbow, a simple grounding touch. It wasn't a gesture of ownership, but of partnership. It said, "I am with you." She lifted her chin, remembering her mother's words. "Never let them see you break, child. Your pride is the one thing they can't take." They were given bowls of thin rabbit stew and stale bread. They sat at the far end of a long table, and the other men shifted away, creating a wide, empty space around them. They were an island in a sea of hate. Delilah tried to eat, but every spoonful felt like swallowing gravel. The warmth of the stew did nothing to chase the chill from her soul. Just when the tension felt like it was about to snap, the door opened again. A man in clerical black stood there, his silver hair catching the lamplight. It was the Reverend Josiah Lyle, a man whose reputation for fairness was known throughout the territory. His eyes, kind and perceptive, swept the room, taking in the scene at a glance. The whispers died. The men looked down at their plates. The Reverend walked directly to their table. "Mr. Boone," he said, his voice warm, "it's good to see you down from the ridge." His gaze then moved to Delilah, and there was no judgment in it, only a gentle curiosity. "And who is this lady?" Before the whispers could start again, Silas spoke, his voice clear and proud. "Reverend, this is Miss Delilah Carter. She's to be my wife." Another shockwave of silence hit the room. If his declaration on the mountain was a thunderclap, this was the lightning that followed. "Wife!" The word hung in the air, charged and dangerous. The Reverend didn't even blink. He simply smiled, a genuine, welcoming smile that seemed to change the temperature of the room. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Carter," he said. "I trust we will see you both for services in the morning. We are a humble congregation, but all are welcome in the Lord's house." He wasn't just offering a welcome, he was offering protection. His public acceptance was a shield, and Silas knew it. "We would be honored, Reverend," Silas replied. his voice thick with a gratitude he rarely showed. After the preacher left, the atmosphere shifted. The open hostility faded into a grudging respect. The keeper's wife even brought them fresh coffee and a slice of apple cake. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start. It was a space to breathe. Later that night, Delilah lay on a narrow cot in the women's dormitory. The other women had given her a wide berth, their whispered conversations ceasing whenever she moved. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was a whirlwind of the day's events. The terror, the rescue, the shocking proposal, the wall of hatred in the common room. A soft knock came at her door. It was the keeper's wife, her face still pinched, but her tone less hostile. "That mountain man of yours wants a word. On the porch, where it's proper." Delilah wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the cold night air. The sky was a riot of stars, more than she had ever seen. Silas stood at the porch rail, a dark silhouette against the Milky Way. He turned as she approached. "I had to say this proper," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What I said on the mountain, it wasn't just words to quiet a crowd. It was a prophecy, but it was also a question." Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Silas," he corrected gently. "My name is Silas. If we are to be partners in this, you should use it." The name felt strange and new on her tongue. "Silas. Why? Why choose me? Everyone looks at me and sees a burden." He turned to face her fully, and even in the dim starlight, his gaze was intense. "I look at you and I see a survivor," he said. "I see a woman who didn't die when she was left to die. I see a woman who held her head high when a room full of men tried to shame her. The mountains are a hard place, Delilah. They break weak things. They haven't broken you." He took a step closer. The air between them crackled. "I am asking you, Delilah Carter, not telling you. Will you be my wife? Will you build a life with me? Will you help me make that prophecy come true?" Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her cheeks. What if, what if I'm not what you think I am? What if you change your mind when you see me in the light of day? "The Lord led me to you in the light of day," he said, his voice unwavering. "I don't question his wisdom. I am a simple man. I say what I mean. I'm offering you my name, my home, and my protection. All I ask in return is your heart and your strength. The rest we'll build together." She looked up at this impossible man, a man who saw strength where others saw weakness, a man who saw a future where others saw only a past, a man who offered a home to a woman who had never truly had one. In the starlit silence of the mountain night, surrounded by a world that didn't want her, Delilah found the one word that could change everything, the one word that felt like coming home. "Yes," she whispered. And as she said it, a shooting star blazed across the heavens, a silent, fiery amen to a promise made between two outcasts under a cold mountain sky. The future was uncertain. The path ahead was dangerous. But for the first time in a long, long time, Delilah wasn't walking it alone. And neither was he. The morning light was thin and pale, but to Delilah it felt like the first day of creation. She stood in the small church, the scent of old wood and beeswax filling her lungs. Her best dress, the only one she had, was wrinkled, but she had smoothed it with her hands until it was presentable. Mrs. Lyle, the Reverend's wife, had come to her room that morning with a gift, a delicate lace collar, yellowed with age but intricately beautiful. "Something borrowed," she'd whispered, her eyes kind. "Every bride deserves something beautiful." Now that collar was fastened at Delilah's throat, a soft, fragile touch against her skin. Silas stood beside her at the simple wooden altar. He wore a clean shirt and a coat that had seen better days, but his beard was neatly trimmed, and he stood as straight and solid as a great pine. He had offered her his arm for the walk from the way station, and he hadn't let go since. His hand in hers was a warm, calloused anchor in a swirling sea of emotions. Word had spread. The pews were filled with curious townspeople. Their whispers followed Delilah down the aisle like a cloud of stinging insects. "Ain't natural. Poor man's gone completely mad. Wonder how long it'll last." But Mrs. Lyle's stern look silenced the worst of them, and Reverend Lyle's voice, calm and steady, filled the sanctuary. pushing back the shadows of their prejudice. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman." Delilah barely heard the words. Her focus was on Silas's hand holding hers, on the quiet strength in his profile, on the impossible reality of this moment. A week ago she was property, discarded and left to die. Today she was a bride. "Do you, Silas Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Silas's voice was a rock, clear, firm, and unshakable. "And do you, Delilah Carter, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She had to swallow past the lump in her throat. She looked at Silas, at this man who had declared her future to a hostile world before he even knew her name. And she found her voice. "I do." The ring he slipped on her finger was a simple, unadorned band of gold. He'd traded 3 of his best beaver pelts for it at the general store that morning. It was warm from his pocket, and it felt impossibly heavy on her hand. It was the weight of a promise, the weight of a future. "What God has joined together," Reverend Lyle declared, his voice ringing with authority, "let no man put asunder." Silas's kiss was brief, his lips chapped from the mountain wind. But it was a seal, a vow made not just with words, but with a touch that promised protection and partnership. When they turned to face the small congregation, Delilah kept her head high. She met the stares of the townspeople not with defiance, but with a quiet dignity that seemed to unnerve them. Some looked away. A few offered small, hesitant smiles. Mrs. Lyle was openly weeping into a handkerchief. They had a small wedding feast in the church kitchen, a simple meal of bean soup and fresh-baked bread provided by Mrs. Lyle. It was more delicious than any feast Delilah could have imagined. As they ate, a few of the town's women, emboldened by Mrs. Lyle's example, came to offer their congratulations. They were awkward and shy, but their words were genuine. "My mother always said a strong woman is a blessing to her husband," one older woman said, patting Delilah's hand. "You've a good man in Silas Boone," another added. "He's quiet, but his heart is true." It was a small thing, but it was everything. It was the first crack in the wall of hate. It was the beginning of acceptance. As the sun began to dip toward the mountains, Silas stood. "It's time we were heading home." Home! The word resonated deep in Delilah's soul. He helped her onto the mule, then swung up behind her, his arms circling her waist. The town fell away below them as they began the long climb up the winding trail into the high country. The air grew colder, sharper, filled with the scent of pine and stone. Delilah leaned back against Silas's chest, feeling his warmth, his steady heartbeat against her back. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Yes," she said. And she wasn't just talking about the cold. For the first time she could remember, a warmth was spreading from the very center of her being. It was the warmth of safety, the warmth of belonging, the warmth of hope. The trail was steep and treacherous. The mule's hooves slipped on loose rock, and the wind tried to tear them from the mountainside. But Silas's arms were a fortress around her. He knew every twist and turn of this trail. This was his world, and now it was hers too. They rode for hours, climbing higher and higher into a realm of silent, snow-dusted peaks and deep, shadowed valleys. The stars came out, impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. They looked close enough to touch. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Silas pulled the mule to a stop. "We're here," he said. Delilah peered through the darkness. Ahead, in a small clearing, stood a cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. A thin tendril of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a sign that Silas had banked his fire before leaving. It wasn't much. It was rustic, isolated, and probably drafty. But as Silas helped her down from the mule, and she took her first steps on the land that was now hers, a profound sense of peace settled over her. This was it, the start of their life together, the place where the prophecy would be fulfilled. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "It's perfect," she whispered. Silas looked at the rough little cabin, then back at her. A slow smile spread across his face, the first real, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger and impossibly handsome. "No," he said, his voice soft. "It's not perfect. Not yet. But we'll make it so. Together." He took her hand and led her to the door. As he pushed it open, the warm, welcoming glow of the banked coals in the hearth spilled out, a beacon in the vast, wild darkness. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It was home. The cabin was a man's space, rough, functional, and utterly devoid of comfort. A single room with a packed earth floor, a stone hearth, a table, two chairs, and a bed in the corner. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, and bundles of dried herbs dangled from the rafters, filling the air with a sharp, clean scent. Delilah woke before dawn, her body aching from the long ride. Silas was already gone, his bedroll neatly tied. She could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe from outside. She rose from the pallet he had made for her by the fire and looked around. This was her new life. This was her home to make. And so she began. She stirred the coals in the hearth, coaxing them back to life. She found a barrel of cornmeal and a side of bacon, and soon the cabin was filled with the smell of breakfast. When Silas came in, his arms loaded with freshly split firewood, he stopped dead in the doorway. He stared at the sizzling bacon, the bubbling pot of coffee, the neat space she had already cleared on the table. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a look of quiet surprise on his face. They fell into a rhythm. Every morning, Silas would rise to chop wood and check his trap lines. Delilah would rise to turn the cabin from a shelter into a home. She swept the floor until it was smooth and clean. She washed the single window's oiled paper until the light streamed in, clear and bright. She organized his tools, sorted his herbs, and scrubbed the table until the wood gleamed. But it was the food that changed everything. Silas was used to a diet of dried meat and hardtack. Delilah, using the simple provisions he had, created magic. She made stews that simmered for hours, filling the cabin with rich, savory smells. She baked cornbread that was light and fluffy. She found wild onions and berries on the edge of the clearing and added them to their meals. For the first time in his life, Silas Boone was eating well, and it was changing him. The hard lines around his eyes began to soften. He started to talk more, telling her stories about the mountains, about his father who had built this cabin with his own two hands, about the ways of the animals. One evening, as she was kneading dough for the next day's bread, she began to sing. It was an old hymn her mother had taught her, a song of hope and resilience. Her voice, rich and melodic, filled the small cabin. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, went completely still. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She faltered, thinking he disliked the sound. "Don't stop," he said, his voice rough. "Please, don't stop." So she sang. Every day as she worked, she sang. The cabin, once a place of silence, was now filled with music. The hymns were prayers of gratitude, songs of a heart that was finally finding peace. The mountains were a lonely place, but they weren't empty. Slowly, cautiously, the neighbors started to appear. They were other mountain folk, trappers and homesteaders who lived miles apart, but were still connected by the invisible threads of a shared, hard life. They came out of curiosity. They'd heard the story of the mountain man and his strange new wife. They came to stare, but they stayed for the coffee and the conversation and the warmth that now radiated from Silas Boone's cabin. Jim Tucker, a grizzled old trapper from the next ridge over, showed up one afternoon with a string of fresh-caught trout. He was a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words at a time in 20 years. Delilah invited him in, sat him down at her clean table, and served him a cup of hot, strong coffee and a thick slice of her apple cake. Jim Tucker stayed for 2 hours. He told her stories of his youth, of fighting bears and tracking wolves. When he left, he shook his head in wonder. "Ain't never felt so welcome," he mumbled to Silas on his way out. "That woman of yours, she's got a gift." Martha Webb, a widow who raised sheep on the lower slopes, came to trade wool for flour. She was a stern, hard woman, her face a mask of grief and struggle. Delilah sat with her, and instead of just trading, she listened. She listened to Martha talk about her late husband, about the loneliness of her life. Delilah shared her own stories of loss, of her mother. When Martha left, her eyes were wet with tears, but her shoulders were straighter. She had traded her wool, but she had found something far more valuable. She had found a friend. Something was happening on Silas Boone's Ridge. A community was being woven, thread by thread, by a woman who had been an outcast. She was turning her home into a sanctuary, a place where lonely souls could find comfort and connection. Silas watched it all, a quiet awe growing in his heart. He had brought this woman here to save her, but now he was realizing a profound truth. She was also saving him. He had lived a life of isolation, his heart walled off from the world. He had thought that was strength, but Delilah was showing him a different kind of strength, the strength of an open heart, the strength of a shared table, the strength of a song lifted up in the wilderness. One evening, they sat by the fire. The snow had begun to fall, thick, silent flakes that were blanketing the world in white. Winter was coming. Delilah placed a hand on her belly. It was still flat, but she felt a change within her, a deep, quiet knowing. She looked at Silas, her eyes shining in the firelight. "The prophecy," she whispered. Silas reached out and placed his large calloused hand over hers, on her belly. He felt a jolt, a connection so powerful it was almost electric. This wasn't just his home anymore. This wasn't just his life. It was theirs, and it was just beginning. But in the valley below, a shadow was stirring. A man who had built an empire on greed was looking up at the mountains. He needed water for his vast herds of cattle, and the creek that flowed past Silas's cabin was the richest source for miles. His name was Horace Rusk, and he was a man who did not like to be told no. He had heard the stories of the mountain man and his new wife, and he saw them not as people, but as an obstacle that needed to be removed. The peace they had built was fragile. The community they had fostered was new, and the storm that was gathering was far more dangerous than any mountain blizzard. Rusk didn't just want their water, he wanted to break them. He wanted to prove that in this world his kind of power, the power of money and paper and lies, would always triumph over their kind of power, the power of faith and community and love. The first real test was coming, and it would test them to their very souls. The first sign of trouble came not as a storm, but as a polite man in a fine suit. He rode up to the cabin one crisp autumn afternoon, his horse looking out of place in the rugged clearing. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing Mr. Horace Rusk. He unrolled a long, official-looking map. "Mr. Rusk has recently acquired the water rights to this entire valley," he said, his voice smooth and cold. He tapped a finger on the blue line that marked their creek. "Including this one. He will be diverting it for his cattle operation starting next month." Silas stood on his porch, his face like stone. "This creek has been part of my family's homestead for 2 generations. My father dug the well that feeds from it with his own hands." The lawyer smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "A sentimental story, but unfortunately your father never properly filed the paperwork with the territorial office. An oversight, I'm sure, but one that Mr. Rusk, a very thorough man, was able to take advantage of. The claim is legally his." He handed Silas a sheaf of papers. "This is a legal notice. You are to cease all use of the water by the 1st of November." He tipped his hat. "Good day." As the lawyer rode away, Delilah came to stand beside Silas. She looked at the papers, then at the creek, the lifeblood of their home, gurgling peacefully over the rocks. "This is wrong," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. "This is theft." "It's how men like Rusk operate," Silas said, his voice grim. "They use paper and laws to steal what they can't take with force." "Then we fight him with truth," Delilah insisted. She placed a hand on her belly, which was now beginning to show a gentle swell. "We are not just fighting for ourselves, Silas. We are fighting for our children." That night they climbed the ladder to the dusty loft of the cabin. In the corner sat his father's old sea chest, a relic from a life before the mountains. "If there are any papers," Silas said, his voice tight, "they'll be in here." He lifted the heavy lid. The chest was filled with the ghosts of his father's life. Old letters, a faded photograph, a compass. They searched through every piece, their hope dwindling with each document they unfolded. There was a bill of sale for the land, a deed for the cabin, but nothing about the water. Nothing, Silas said, his shoulders slumping. The lawyer was right. Pawn never filed the papers. Defeated, he started to close the lid, but Delilah stopped him. Her eyes had caught on something tucked into a side pocket of the chest. A book. It was his father's Bible, worn and soft with age. As Silas lifted it, a single piece of paper, folded and yellowed, fluttered out from between the pages and drifted to the floor. Delilah picked it up. It was a letter, written in his father's spidery hand. "My son," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. Know that this land is a gift, not from any government or office, but from the Lord himself. The water, the trees, the very soil. It is our inheritance. There will be men who try to take it with their clever papers and their soulless laws. Do not let them. A man's right is not written on paper. It is written on his heart. It is proven by his sweat and his faith. Stand by what the Lord gave you, son. Stand firm." Tears welled in Delilah's eyes. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew someone like Rusk would come one day." The letter wasn't a legal document. It wouldn't hold up in any court. But it was something more. It was a testament. It was a call to arms. "We may not have a paper claim," Silas said, his voice filled with a new resolve as he looked from the letter to his wife. "But we have a righteous one." Their first move was to rally their newfound community. Silas and Delilah rode from homestead to homestead, from trapping camp to sheep meadow. They shared the story of Rusk's claim and showed their neighbors his father's letter. At first, people were afraid. Rusk was a powerful man. To stand against him was to risk everything. But then Martha Webb, the widow, stood up. "When my husband died, Rusk's men tried to run me off my land too," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "They said a woman couldn't hold a claim alone. Delilah and Silas showed me what it means to be a neighbor. I'll stand with them." Then Jim Tucker, the old trapper, spoke. "That creek feeds this whole side of the mountain. If Rusk takes it, he starves us all out. I'm with Boone." One by one, they pledged their support. The outcasts had built a community, and now that community was rising up to defend its own. They decided to hold a gathering, a supper at their cabin, a celebration of community and a show of unity, a peaceful protest. Delilah spent days cooking. The scent of roasting venison and baking bread filled the entire ridge. On the day of the supper, they came. Dozens of them, settlers, trappers, even a family of Ute, who considered the stream a sacred place. They gathered in the clearing around the cabin, a patchwork of different peoples united by a common threat. They shared food. They shared stories. They sang hymns as the sun went down, their voices rising up to the heavens. It was a beautiful, powerful moment. But Rusk had been watching. As the celebration was in full swing, 3 men rode into the clearing. They were Rusk's men, rough and dangerous, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. The man in the lead was Rusk's foreman, a brute named Colby. "Having a party, Boone?" Colby sneered, his eyes sweeping over the diverse crowd with contempt. Mr. Rusk sent a message. "This land belongs to him. This water belongs to him. You're all trespassing." Silas stepped forward. "This is our home, and these are our guests. You're the one who's trespassing." Colby laughed. He dismounted and his men fanned out behind him. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. "We're not here to talk," Colby said, his hand dropping to his gun. "We're here to deliver an eviction notice." But before he could take another step, Jim Tucker moved to stand beside Silas, his old hunting rifle in his hands. Then 2 more homesteaders stepped up, flanking them. The Ute men rose silently from their log benches, their faces impassive but their eyes hard. The community formed a human wall in front of the cabin, in front of Delilah. Colby hesitated. He had expected a lone mountain man. He was not prepared for a united front. He looked at the determined faces. He looked at the rifles. He spit on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled. He climbed back on his horse, and he and his men rode away, swallowed by the darkness. A cheer went up from the crowd. They had faced down the bully. They had won. But as Silas held Delilah close in the firelight, he knew this was only the first battle. Rusk was not a man who gave up. He had tried intimidation and failed. His next move would be more subtle and far more vicious. He would come for the heart of their new life. He would come for Delilah. And he would use the one weapon they couldn't fight with rifles: the law. The real war was about to begin. Horace Rusk was not a man accustomed to failure. He sat in his opulent study, the walls covered with maps of his ever-expanding cattle empire, and seethed. The report from his foreman, Colby, about the unified stand on Boone's Ridge had ignited a cold fury within him. They had defied him, a collection of dirt-scratching homesteaders, a half-wild mountain man, and his oversized black wife. They had dared to stand in his way. His plan to simply take the water had failed. Now he needed a new strategy. He needed to break their little community. And to do that, he needed to break its heart. He needed to remove Delilah. He sent a telegram to a contact in Tennessee, a man who specialized in digging up dirt and manufacturing lies. The instructions were simple. Find anything, anything at all, on a woman named Delilah Carter. If you can't find anything, create it. Weeks passed. The snows came, blanketing the high country in a deep, silent white. Life in the cabin was peaceful. The threat from Rusk seemed to have receded. Delilah's pregnancy was advancing, her belly a beautiful, perfect curve. She and Silas spent their evenings by the fire, planning for the future, for the arrival of their twins. They felt safe, they felt secure, and that was their mistake. One morning they needed to go into town for supplies. The trip down the mountain was slow and difficult in the snow, but they were in good spirits. As they rode into town, however, they noticed a change. People who had been friendly before now averted their eyes. The whispers were back, colder and more venomous than before. They didn't understand. They had stood their ground. They had won. Or so they thought. As they were loading their supplies into their wagon, the town sheriff, a man named Wexler, approached them. He was not alone. Beside him stood the lawyer from before, and two grim-faced deputies. "Silas Boone," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "I have a warrant here." "A warrant for what?" Silas asked, stepping in front of Delilah. The lawyer smiled, a triumphant, predatory expression. He held up a document. "This is a warrant for the arrest of runaway indentured property, a woman known as Delilah Carter." The world seemed to stop. "What?" Silas's voice was a low growl. "That's a lie. My wife is a free woman." "Not according to this," the lawyer said, tapping the paper. "We have a legally binding contract of indenture, signed by Delilah Carter in the state of Tennessee. She fled before her term of service was complete. She is a fugitive." Delilah's blood ran cold. It was happening again. The old nightmare she thought she had escaped was reaching out to drag her back. "No," she whispered, her hand going to her belly. "It's not true. My mother, she was free. I was born free." "Your mother," the lawyer said with cruel precision, "signed this contract to pay off her debts shortly before her death, a debt which then passed to you. It's all here, signed and sealed." It was a lie, a monstrous, tangled lie. But it was a lie written on official-looking paper. And in this world, paper was more powerful than truth. "Sheriff," Silas pleaded, his voice cracking, "you know this is Rusk's doing. You know this is wrong." Sheriff Wexler wouldn't meet his eyes. "My hands are tied, Silas. The documents are from a Tennessee court. They look legal. I have to uphold the law." "This isn't law," Silas roared. "This is a kidnapping." The deputies moved in, their hands on their pistols. "Don't make this difficult, Boone," Wexler warned. He stepped past Silas and reached for Delilah. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. A cold, terrifying calm settled over her. She knew a fight would only get Silas killed. She looked at her husband, her eyes filled with love and a silent plea. "Don't fight. Live. Live for our children." The sheriff pulled a pair of iron manacles from his belt. The sound of the metal clicking shut around Delilah's wrists was the ugliest sound Silas had ever heard. It echoed through the silent, watching street. A crowd had gathered. Some looked on with pity, others with a smug satisfaction. No one stepped forward to help. The community they had built, the unity they had celebrated, shattered in an instant under the weight of this new insidious attack. They led her away, her pregnant belly straining against the thin fabric of her dress. She walked with her head held high, a queen in chains, her dignity a silent rebuke to the entire town. Silas watched, helpless, as they locked her in the town jail. The iron door slammed shut, a sound of absolute finality. The lawyer turned to him, his smile a mask of pure evil. "Since she is not legally free, your marriage is null and void," he said smoothly. "And since you have no legal wife, your claim to that homestead, as a single man, is now under review. Mr. Rusk will be taking possession of the land and the water by the end of the week. You have until then to vacate." It was a perfect trap. In one single brutal stroke, Rusk had taken everything. His wife, his children, his home, his future. Silas stood alone in the snowy street, the world crumbling around him. He had fought Rusk's men with strength and won. But he didn't know how to fight this. How do you fight a lie? How do you fight a piece of paper? Despair, black and suffocating, washed over him. He had made a promise. He had made a prophecy. "By winter, you'll birth me twins." Winter was here, and his wife was in a jail cell, his children destined to be born into slavery. The prophecy had become a curse. The cabin was a tomb. The fire in the hearth was dead, the ashes cold. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on Silas from all sides. Every object in the room screamed Delilah's absence. The curtains she had sewn, the pot of beans left soaking on the stove, the rocking chair she sat in every evening, humming her hymns as she knitted clothes for the babies. He sank into that chair, and the ghost of her scent, cinnamon and wood smoke, rose up to mock him. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with his hands, with his axe, with his rifle. But this problem was a ghost, a whisper, a lie on a piece of paper miles away. He was powerless. The feeling was so foreign, so deeply wrong, that it made him physically ill. He sat there for a full day and a night, not moving, not eating. The cold seeped into the cabin, into his bones, into his soul. He was back to where he had been before her, alone. But it was 1,000 times worse now, because now he knew what he had lost. On the second morning, a knock came at the door. He didn't answer. He didn't have the strength. The door creaked open. It was Reverend Lyle. He took in the scene, the cold hearth, the untouched food, the broken man in the rocking chair, and his face filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. "Silas," he said softly, "you cannot give up." "It's over." Silas's voice was a dead, hollow thing. "They have her. They have the law on their side." "They have a lie on their side," the Reverend corrected gently. "And lies, no matter how well dressed, cannot stand against the truth." He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "I have been sending telegrams. To a colleague in Nashville. He is making inquiries. We are not beaten yet." A tiny flicker of something, not hope, but something less than absolute despair, stirred in Silas's chest. "What can I do?" he whispered. "You can fight," the Reverend said, "but not with your fists, with your faith, and with your memory. Think, Silas. Delilah told you her story. Was there anything at all that could prove her freedom?" Silas's mind was a fog of grief. He tried to remember their conversations. She had told him about her mother, a free woman, a seamstress. She had told him about the chaos after her mother's death, how men had come and taken everything. And then a memory surfaced, faint but there. "My mama had a Bible," Delilah had said one night, her voice soft with remembered pain. "She kept everything important in it. Her name, my name, the date I was born. She said it was our history, our proof." Silas's head shot up. "Her mother's Bible," he said, his voice raw. "Where is it?" the Reverend asked, his eyes lighting up. "Gone," Silas said, the flicker of hope dying as quickly as it had appeared. "She told me it was lost, taken when those men came. It was in the wagon, the one Jenkins abandoned. It must have gone over the cliff when the wagon fell." The Reverend's face fell. "I see." He stayed for a while longer, trying to offer words of comfort, but they were meaningless. The one piece of evidence that could save her was gone, lost to the unforgiving mountains. After the Reverend left, Silas was alone again with his despair. The Bible. It was the key. And it was gone. He stumbled through the cabin, his grief a physical, staggering force. He ended up in the loft, the place where they had found his father's letter. He opened the old chest, not knowing what he was looking for. A sign. A miracle. His fingers brushed against his father's old Bible. He pulled it out, its weight familiar in his hands. He opened it, the pages falling open to a passage his father had underlined. The truth shall set you free. A bitter laugh escaped Silas's lips. The truth was at the bottom of a ravine, buried under 100 feet of snow. He was about to close the book when he saw it, something he had never noticed before. Tucked deep into the binding, almost invisible, was a small, folded piece of oilcloth. His father had used oilcloth to protect important things from the weather. His fingers, clumsy with cold and trembling with a sudden, terrible hope, worked the packet free. He unfolded it. Inside was not a document. It was a key. A small, ornate brass key. He didn't recognize it. It didn't belong to the cabin or any lock he had ever seen. On a tiny, faded piece of paper attached to the key with a string was his father's handwriting. For what is lost? That was it. Just those 4 words. For what is lost? It made no sense. It was a riddle, a key to an unknown lock, a message from the grave. He stared at the key, lying in his palm. It was maddening. It was a promise of something, but he had no idea what. Was this a sign from his father? From God? Or was it just another dead end? Another cruel trick of hope in a hopeless world? He didn't know. But as he closed his hand around the cold metal of the key, he knew one thing. He was done waiting. He was done despairing. He was a man of the mountains. And if the answer he needed was at the bottom of a ravine, buried under the snow, then that's where he would go. He would tear that mountain apart with his bare hands if he had to. He had a key. He didn't know what it opened, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that it was the first step, the first move in a fight that was far from over. He was going to find the truth, and the truth was going to set his wife free. The descent was madness. Silas stood at the edge of the ravine, the same spot where he had found Delilah. The wind howled, whipping snow into his face. Below, the wreckage of the wagon was a dark scar against the white, 1,000 feet down a near vertical drop. No one could survive that fall. Nothing could. But Silas wasn't looking for a survivor. He was looking for a book. He tied a thick rope to the base of a sturdy pine, the same rope he used to haul elk carcasses up from steep canyons. He tested it with his full weight, the fibers groaning in protest. Then, without a second thought, he swung himself over the edge. The world became a dizzying blur of rock and ice and snow. His hands, wrapped in thick leather, burned from the friction of the rope. His boots scrabbled for purchase on the sheer cliff face. He descended, foot by treacherous foot, the wind trying to tear him from his lifeline. He was not a religious man in the way the Reverend was. His church was the mountains, his prayers the silent conversations he had with the wind and the stars. But as he dangled over the abyss, he prayed. He prayed to his father's God, to Delilah's God, for strength, for a miracle. After what felt like an eternity, his feet touched something solid. He had reached the wreckage. The wagon was smashed to splinters, its contents scattered across the snowy ledge. Crates were broken, sacks of flour had burst, creating a ghostly white paste. It was a scene of total destruction. He began to search. His hands, already numb with cold, dug through the snow and the debris. He was searching for a needle in a haystack, a small, leather-bound book in a wasteland of splintered wood and frozen earth. He searched for hours. The sun began to dip below the peaks, casting the ravine into a deep purple shadow. The temperature was dropping fast. If he didn't find it soon, he would freeze to death down here. His fingers brushed against something. Not the hard spine of a book, but something else. Something metal. He dug it out of the snow. It was a small, locked metal box, rusted and dented from the fall, but intact. He stared at it. It was a document box, the kind people used to keep important papers safe. And on the front, there was a small, ornate, brass lock. His heart stopped. With trembling, frozen fingers, He pulled the key from his pocket, the key his father had hidden, the key with the note that said, "For what is lost." He slid the key into the lock. It was stiff with cold and rust, but with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he turned it. There was a click, a small, beautiful, miraculous click. The lock sprang open. He lifted the lid. Inside, protected from the elements by the metal box, was a Bible. Delilah's mother's Bible. It was damp but not destroyed. He opened it. And there, tucked between the pages of the Old and New Testaments, was a folded document wrapped in oilcloth. He carefully unfolded it. It was her mother's certificate of freedom. But that wasn't all. Tucked behind it was another document, a legal deposition, signed and notarized by a Nashville judge. He began to read, his breath catching in his throat. It was Delilah's mother's story, in her own words. It told of a loan she had taken from a man named Whitaker, but it also told of how she had paid it back, in full, months before her death. The deposition included receipts, canceled notes. It was ironclad proof that there was no debt, no indenture. But the final lines of the deposition were what made Silas's blood run cold. "Mr. Whitaker has made threats against my person," Delilah's mother had written. "He works in concert with a man out west, a cattle baron named Horace Rusk. They have a scheme, using false debt claims to force free black folk into servitude on the western frontier, where the laws are new and easily bent. If anything should happen to me, know that it was not an accident, and I fear they will come for my daughter next. It wasn't just a lie, it was a conspiracy, a criminal enterprise that stretched 1,000 miles, from the back rooms of Tennessee to the mountains of the West. Rusk hadn't just found a convenient lie. He had helped create it. This was his pattern. This was his business. And Delilah's mother had known. She had fought back. She had created this time capsule of truth, this box of evidence, to protect her daughter, even from beyond the grave. But how had his father gotten the key? Then he understood. His father had been a territorial ranger. He must have crossed paths with Whitaker, or Rusk, or maybe even Delilah's mother. He must have known about the scheme. He must have gotten the key somehow to protect the evidence, hiding it for the day it would be needed. He had died before he could tell Silas the whole story, leaving only the cryptic note. For what is lost? He wasn't talking about the Bible. He was talking about justice. Silas held the proof in his hands, the truth that would not only free his wife, but would destroy Horace Rusk forever. He had to get back up the cliff. The climb was a nightmare. His body was screaming with exhaustion. The cold was a physical pain that threatened to shut down his limbs. He slipped, his boots finding no purchase, and dangled by his raw, bleeding hands. He looked down into the blackness. It would be so easy to let go. But then he thought of Delilah, of her face in the jailhouse window, of her hand on her belly. He found a strength he didn't know he possessed. He pulled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, fighting for every handhold. He collapsed at the top of the ravine, gasping for air, his body a symphony of pain. But he was alive, and clutched to his chest, more precious than gold, was a rusted metal box that held the key to everything. He got to his feet. He had a long ride ahead of him. He wasn't just going back to the town. He was going to the territorial capital, to the highest judge in the land. He was no longer on the defensive. He was on the attack. He wasn't just going to free his wife. He was going to get justice for her mother. He was going to burn Rusk's empire of lies to the ground. The mountain man was coming, and he was bringing hell with him. The territorial courthouse was a temple of power. Marble columns, polished wood, and men in dark suits who spoke in whispers. Silas Boone, in his buckskins and his mud-caked boots, stood out like a wolf in a sheep pen. He had ridden for 2 days straight, not stopping to eat or sleep, the metal box clutched in his hands. He was told Judge Harrison was a hard man, an honest man, but one who did not suffer fools. Silas bypassed the clerks, the lawyers, the entire bureaucracy. He walked straight to the doors of the judge's chambers and knocked. When a clerk tried to stop him, Silas just looked at him. There was a fire in his eyes that made the clerk take a step back. The door opened. Judge Harrison was an old man with eyes as sharp and clear as ice. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge demanded. "My name is Silas Boone," Silas said, his voice hoarse, And I have evidence of a crime that will shock this territory to its core. A crime that involves murder, slavery, and the man you consider to be one of this territory's most prominent citizens, Horace Rusk. The judge's eyes narrowed. Those are serious accusations, Mr. Boone. I have serious proof, Your Honor, Silas said. He placed the rusted metal box on the judge's desk. And I have a story to tell. The trial was a sensation. It was moved from the small town back to the territorial capital. The courtroom was packed every day. Horace Rusk sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief. He had brought in the best lawyers money could buy, but he didn't have the truth. Silas was the first to testify. He told the story of finding Delilah, of their marriage, of the false indenture papers. He told of the descent into the ravine, and then he opened the box. When he read Delilah's mother's deposition aloud, a wave of shock and horror swept through the courtroom. The story of the conspiracy, the threats, the fear for her daughter's life, it was a tale of pure, unadulterated evil. Next, Reverend Lyle testified. His contact in Nashville had found more evidence. He had found the man who had forged the indenture papers. The man, under oath, admitted that he had been paid by Rusk's agent in Tennessee. He testified that Delilah's mother's death, ruled an accident at the time, had been highly suspicious. The walls were closing in on Rusk. Then a surprise witness was called. Henry Tall Elk, the youth scout. He walked to the stand with a quiet dignity that commanded the room's attention. He testified that he had been a scout for a territorial survey team years ago. He had witnessed Horace Rusk bribing surveyors to falsify maps and reports, stealing land and water not just from settlers, but from the Ute people. He provided names, dates, and locations. It was a devastating blow, proving a long-standing pattern of criminal fraud. Rusk's lawyers tried to discredit him. The word of a savage against a respected businessman? One of them sneered. Henry Tall Elk looked directly at the jury. This savage knows the difference between a straight line and a crooked one, he said, his voice calm and clear. Mr. Rusk does not. Finally, Delilah was called to the stand. She walked to the witness box, no longer a prisoner, but a survivor. Her pregnancy was now obvious to all, a silent testament to the future that had almost been stolen from her. She told her story, the story of her mother, of her freedom, of the lies that had been used to enslave her. Her voice did not tremble. She did not cry. She spoke the truth with a simple, powerful grace that held the entire courtroom spellbound. Mr. Rusk, the prosecutor asked, did not know you. Why would he do this to you? Delilah looked across the room, her eyes meeting Horace Rusk's. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound, sorrowful pity. He did not do this to me because of who I am, she said, her voice ringing with clarity. He did it because of what I am. To him, I was not a person. I was a tool, a pawn in his game to get my husband's land. He thought that because of the color of my skin and because I was a woman, that I was weak, that I had no voice, that I had no value. She placed a hand on her belly. He was wrong. It was over. The jury took less than an hour. Horace Rusk was found guilty. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of conspiracy to commit enslavement. Guilty of being an accessory to murder. His empire crumbled. His land was seized. His water rights were revoked. He was sentenced to life in prison. As they led him away in chains, his arrogant mask finally broke, revealing the pathetic, greedy man underneath. Justice had been served. Silas and Delilah stood on the steps of the courthouse, the winter sun warm on their faces. The crowd that had once scorned them now cheered for them. They were heroes. Reverend and Mrs. Lyle were there, their faces beaming. Henry Tall Elk stood beside them, a rare smile on his lips. Even Sheriff Wexler came to offer a shamefaced but sincere apology. Let's go home, Delilah said softly, leaning her head on Silas's shoulder. The journey back up the mountain was different this time. They were not two outcasts fleeing the world. They were a family returning in triumph. When they reached their ridge, they saw that the entire community was waiting for them. A great bonfire was blazing in the clearing. The table was laden with food. Their neighbors, the people they had brought together, were there to welcome them home. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, and the cabin was filled with the warmth of friends and the sound of laughter, Delilah's labor began. It was a long, difficult night, but she was not alone. Mrs. Lyle was there, acting as midwife. Martha Webb was there, holding her hand. The women of the community kept vigil, praying and singing hymns through the night. Just before dawn, the first cry echoed through the cabin, a strong, healthy wail, and a moment later it was joined by a second. Silas, his face wet with tears, brought the two tiny squirming bundles to Delilah. He laid them in her arms, a boy and a girl, perfect and whole. He looked at his wife, her face radiant with exhaustion and love. He looked at his children, the future he had almost lost. He remembered his own words, spoken on a desperate, hopeful impulse on a lonely mountain trail. "By winter," he whispered, his voice thick with awe, "you'll birth me twins." Delilah smiled, her tears mingling with his. The prophecy was fulfilled. The promise was kept. Outside, the sun rose, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. A new day was dawning, a day of peace, a day of justice, a day of love. In a small cabin, high in the mountains, surrounded by a community built not on land or law, but on shared kindness, a family was born. Two outcasts who had found each other in a storm and created a sanctuary. Their story became a legend in those mountains. A story of how even in the deepest wilderness, in the face of the cruelest injustice, the truth can be found. And how love, true and unwavering, can make even the most impossible prophecies come true. Thank you for listening to this story. Stories like this remind us that courage and truth can be found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this journey and believe in the power of a story to change the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We share new stories every single day, and we'd be honored to have you join our community. Until next time, stay strong and never stop fighting for what's right.